What if the most dangerous position on a battlefield isn't the one firing at U-boot, the one that isn't moving at all? For centuries, armies have been trained to fear visible threats. Fortified artillery silhouettes, trenches cut into the earth. Yet again and again, history shows something far more lethal: the terrain that appears abandoned, quiet, irrelevant, and empty hills. No banners, no muzzle flashes, no obvious defensive works. Just dirt, grass, and silence. And silence, in war, is rarely neutral. Commanders love certainty. Maps reward clarity. A hill with no observed enemy activity becomes a footnote in the briefing, a low-priority objective, a convenient route forward. Reconnaissance reports mark it as clear. Scouts pass through without contact. Aerial photos show nothing but shadows and contours. The conclusion feels rational. This ground is safe. And that conclusion is exactly where the trap begins, because the absence of resistance is not the same as the absence of preparation. Throughout military history, the most devastating ambushes did not come from overwhelming firepower, but from patience measured, disciplined, almost invisible patience. An enemy that refuses to reveal itself forces the attacker to supply its own assumptions, and assumptions, once accepted, hardened into confidence. Confidence becomes routine. Routine becomes carelessness. This is how hills are underestimated. An empty hill invites movement. Troops relax spacing. Engineers move forward without full clearance. Vehicles cluster. Commanders stop thinking tactically and start thinking administratively. How fast can we move through this sector? How quickly can we exploit the gap? The terrain becomes something to cross, not something to interrogate. And that shift in mindset is more dangerous than any weapon. What makes these positions uniquely lethal is not just concealment, but depth. A hill is not a surface, it is volume. Soil can be carved, rock can be hollowed, space can be shaped below ground in ways that aerial reconnaissance, satellite imagery, and even ground patrols struggle to detect. An enemy that understands this doesn't need to defend the hill. They let you take it. They wait until you belong to it. And when the ground opens figuratively, or literally, the psychological shock is immediate. Soldiers don't just face fire. They face betrayal by the environment itself. The earth they trusted becomes hostile. Orientation collapses. Orders lag behind events. What should have been a simple advance turns into chaos measured in seconds. This isn't theoretical. It has happened in multiple wars across continents, under different flags and armies with superior numbers, better equipment, and full air dominance have all fallen into the same cognitive trap, equating quiet with safety. The hill didn't fight back because it didn't need to. It waited. What's most unsettling is how predictable this pattern is. Every generation believes its senses are better, its intelligence more complete, its technology more decisive. Yet the basic human error remains unchanged. We trust what we can see. We discount what we can't. And in warfare, the unseen is often the weapon. Even experienced units are vulnerable. Veterans learn to read terrain, but reading terrain requires time, skepticism, and imagination. It requires asking uncomfortable questions when nothing seems wrong. And in fast-moving operations, those questions are the first things sacrificed. So when a hill looks empty, the real question is not who is there but Why no one wants you to think anyone is? Because some positions are not meant to be defended from the outside. They are designed to be activated from within. Before we go any further, pause for a second and think about what this really means. How many times in history did armies fail not because they lacked firepower, but because they misunderstood the ground beneath them? If this opening already changed the way you look at something as simple as a hill, that's exactly why this story matters. Take a moment now and leave a comment. Tell me, have you ever heard of a battle where the terrain itself became the weapon? Or simply comment the word underground if you're starting to see how deceptive silence can be in war. Make sure to hit the like button if you want more stories that expose the hidden layers of military history, stories that go beyond maps, dates, and obvious battles that single click tells. The algorithm, this kind of deep, strategic content deserves to be seen. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now. This channel is built for people who want to understand how wars are really decided by miscalculations, overlooked details, and moments when certainty collapses into chaos. Every military disaster begins long before the first shot is fired. It begins on paper, in briefing rooms, on maps where certainty feels absolute, and ambiguity is quietly erased. The underestimation of the empty hill is rarely an accident. It is the logical result of a chain of decisions that all seem reasonable when viewed in isolation. The first mistake is procedural. Intelligence assessments prioritize what can be confirmed. Enemy units seen, positions identified, weapons detected. When reconnaissance returns with nothing concrete, no heat signatures, no visible fortifications, no intercepted communications data, absence of data is subconsciously converted into data itself. Nothing detected becomes nothing there. That shift feels harmless, but it is fatal. Commanders are trained to manage risk, not paranoia. They cannot afford to treat every patch of terrain as hostile without cause. So when multiple sources converge on the same conclusion, clear hill, no resistance, low probability of contact, the decision hardens, units are reassigned. Fire support is redirected. The hill becomes a gap in the enemy's defense, an opportunity rather than a threat. But this logic ignores a crucial asymmetry. Preparation does not require visibility. An enemy planning a subterranean defense has no incentive to contest the surface. In fact, surface activity would be counterproductive. It would invite scrutiny, provoke bombardment, and forced early engagement. True concealment demands restraint. Silence is not a lack of capability. It is a signal of discipline. The second mistake is cultural. Modern armies are shaped by doctrine, and doctrine is shaped by previous wars. If the last conflict rewarded speed, maneuver, and aggressive exploitation of breakthroughs, commanders internalize those lessons. They learn to fear stagnation more than uncertainty. An unoccupied hill on a key axis of advance feels like an invitation to maintain momentum. Stopping to overanalyze it feels like hesitation. This is where arrogance quietly enters the equation, not personal arrogance, but institutional confidence. Superior technology reinforces it. Thermal imaging, ground-penetrating radar, aerial surveillance. Each tool reduces uncertainty in specific contexts, but none eliminate it entirely. When these systems show nothing, the conclusion feels scientifically validated. The possibility that the enemy has deliberately adapted to evade these tools is rarely given equal weight. And then there is time pressure. Operational timelines compress this. Commanders are measured by progress, Delays must be justified. Every pause invites questions from higher command. So, the hill, categorized as low risk, units are told to pass through, occupy temporarily, or simply move beyond it. The more often this happens without consequence, the more the assumption reinforces itself. This is how patterns form, and patterns are dangerous in war. What makes this misread especially lethal is that it often coincides with moments of perceived advantage. The enemy appears to be retreating. Supply lines seem disrupted. Resistance elsewhere is weakening. The empty hill fits neatly into a narrative of collapse. It confirms what commanders already believe, that the enemy is on the back foot, improvising, running out of options. In reality, the opposite may be true. Subterranean defenses require time, labor, and foresight. They are not acts of desperation. They are investments. An enemy willing to abandon surface control in favor of underground dominance is signaling patience and intent. They are not trying to stop your advance everywhere. They are choosing where to break it. And once troops commit to the hill, once vehicles cluster, infantry spreads out, command posts form, the geometry of the battlefield flips. What looked like empty space becomes a kill zone defined not by what surrounds it, but by what lies beneath it. Escape routes narrow. Reaction times collapse. Confusion multiplies faster than orders can travel. The tragedy is that, in hindsight, the warning signs are always visible. The enemy's silence, the lack of harassment, the absence of hasty defenses where they would normally appear. But in the moment, these signs are interpreted as weakness rather than intent. At a certain point in military history, terrain stopped being something armies fought on and started becoming something they fought with. The empty hill is the purest expression of that shift. It is not a defensive position in the traditional sense. There are no parapets to storm, no visible guns to silence, no line to break. The hill does not resist occupation, it absorbs it. This is where the attacker's mental model fails completely. Most military training treats terrain as a modifier. High ground gives advantage. Low ground invites danger. Forests restrict movement. Open plains favor firepower. These are passive qualities. The Hilasopan breaks that framework. Here terrain is active. It is designed to perform a function at a precise moment against a precise behavior. The key insight behind this tactic is brutal in its simplicity. Armies move, predictably, when they believe they are safe. Once that belief takes hold, formations loosen, spacing collapses, command nodes drift forward, and vigilance erodes. The hill doesn't need to stop the enemy at the edge. It waits until the enemy reorganizes on top of it. This is not just concealment. It is choreography. Subterranean warfare transforms three dimensions of battle. First, it inverts visibility. The attacker sees everything above ground and assumes control. The defender sees nothing above ground and knows exactly where the attacker will concentrate. Second, it collapses reaction time. Fire emerging from beneath or within the terrain does not give the warning that conventional defenses do. There is no build-up, no escalation, only rupture. Third, it weaponizes confusion. Soldiers are trained to orient using terrain features. When the terrain itself becomes hostile, orientation disintegrates. An empty hill that opens beneath advancing troops does more than inflict casualties. It shatters cohesion. Units lose their sense of direction. Commanders lose their ability to synchronize response. Radios fill with overlapping reports that contradict each other. Is the enemy behind us, beneath us, inside the hill? The question itself becomes perilous. What makes this tactic so effective is that it bypasses strength entirely. Firepower becomes irrelevant in the first moments. Numbers don't matter when they are compressed into a space that was never meant to contain them. Armor becomes liability when mobility is constrained. Even air support struggles to respond when the threat has no clear external signet. And this is deliberate. A hill converted into a weapon is not meant to be held. It is meant to be triggered. The defender accepts that the position may be abandoned afterward, collapsed, or sealed. The objective is not territorial control. It is disruption, delay, attrition, psychological dominance. Once attackers experience this kind of shock, they carry it forward. Every hill becomes suspect. Every patch of ground demands scrutiny. Tempo slows. Momentum dies. The hill continues to influence the battle long after the fighting around it ends. This is why such positions are often prepared far in advance, sometimes months or years before they are ever used. Engineers carve chambers, firing ports, escape routes, and internal lines of movement. Ventilation is disguised, spoil is removed carefully to avoid detection. Nothing about this is improvised. The hill is treated like a system, not a location. And crucially, the defender never signals ownership. No flags, no patrols, no surface activity. The hill must look irrelevant, worthless, forgettable. Because the moment the attacker begins to respect the hill, its value decreases. Respect triggers caution. Caution disrupts the sequence. The weapon only works if the enemy walks willingly into its geometry. This is why the most dangerous terrain is not the one that dominates the skyline, but the one that disappears into the background of the map. The hill that planners circle and label as clear is far more valuable than the one marked contested Sache that moment. The hill is no longer part of the landscape. It is part of the strategy. To understand how an empty hill becomes lethal, you have to stop thinking like a soldier and start thinking like an engineer. Not an engineer building bridges or fortifications, but one designing absence, because the most important feature of a subterranean hill system is not what it contains, but what it deliberately hides. From above ground, nothing must suggest preparation. No disturbed soil patterns, no vehicle tracks, no unnatural vegetation growth. Even the spoil from excavation, the dirt and rock removed to create underground spaces managed with obsessive care, it is scattered slowly, often miles away, mixed into riverbanks, spread beneath foliage, or reused in unrelated construction. The goal is simple: make the hill visually boring. Below ground, however, the logic changes completely. Subterranean systems are built in layers, not lines. There is rarely a single tunnel or chamber. Instead, there are networks, excess shafts, firing galleries, listening posts, ammunition caches, medical alcoves, command cells, escape routes. Each space has a purpose, and no single space is critical. If one collapses, others remain functional. Redundancy is survival. One of the first elements constructed is depth variation. Tunnels, ari, not dug at a uniform level. They rise and fall, forcing anyone unfamiliar with the system to slow down, disorienting them, exhausting them. These changes in elevation also protect against explosives. Shockwaves dissipate unevenly, reducing the effectiveness of surface bombardment. A bomb may destroy a chamber, but leave adjacent corridors intact. Ventilation is another invisible weapon. Air shafts are disguised as natural cracks, animal burrows, or drainage channels. Some are fitted with baffles to block light and sound. Others are deliberately positioned to draw air through the system using temperature differentials rather than mechanical fans. This eliminates noise, heat signatures, and maintenance requirements. The hill breathes, but no one notices. Firing positions are never obvious. They are cut at angles, often just wide enough for a weapon barrel, sometimes concealed behind thin layers of soil or stone that can be broken from within. These apertures are designed to be opened only at the moment of engagement. Until then, they are invisible even at close range. When they activate, fire seems to erupt from the ground itself. Movement within the hill is horizontal and vertical. Ladders, ramps, and narrow shafts allow defenders to appear in one place, vanish, and reappear somewhere else seconds later. This creates the illusion of greater numbers. Attackers believe they are facing multiple units when in reality they are being engaged by the same few fighters, repositioning rapidly inside the system. Psychologically, this is devastating. Soldiers rely on cause and effect. Fire comes from a direction, suppress that direction, and the threat diminishes. Underground systems break this logic. Suppression does nothing when the enemy is not where the fire lands. Bombardment feels futile. Even successful hits provide no visible feedback. There is no confirmation of damage, no sense of progress. Another critical feature is patience built into the design. These systems are not meant for constant occupation. Fighters can remain underground for extended periods without revealing themselves. Food caches, water storage, waste disposal, even basic medical treatment are accounted for. The hill can remain dormant through reconnaissance, patrols, even partial occupation above ground. The system only activates when conditions are optimal. That activation is usually synchronized. Multiple firing points open at once. Explosives detonate from beneath, footpaths, or staging areas. Smoke, dust, and debris obscure vision. The attacker's mental map collapses instantly. Where is the enemy? How many are there? Where is safe ground? The answers arrive too slowly to matter. And when the initial shock passes, the system shifts again. Some tunnels collapse deliberately, sealing sections behind the defenders as they withdraw deeper. Others open to allow counterattacks from unexpected angles. The hill is not static. It adapts moment by moment, reshaping the fight. What makes these systems especially dangerous is that they turn time against the attacker. The longer troops remain in the area, the more vulnerable they become. Fatigue sets in. Caution slows movement. Suspicion replaces confidence. The hill doesn't need to kill everyone. It only needs to disrupt enough to halt momentum. And by the time the attacker understands what they are standing on, they are already inside the architecture of the trap. There is a precise instant when an operation stops being an advance and becomes a disaster. It doesn't begin with panic. It begins with confusion brief, almost imperceptible confusion when reality no longer matches expectation. Troops move across the hill exactly as planned. Vehicles idle. Engineers fan out. Infantry spreads into what doctrine calls temporary security posture. Radios hum with routine traffic. No one is scanning the ground beneath their boots. No one is listening for a movement that has no direction. That is when the hill decides the timing. The first sign is rarely dramatic. A dull concussion, not a sharp blast. a vibration that feels wrong, too close, too contained. Dust lifts straight up instead of outward. Soldiers freeze for half a second, trying to identify the source. That pause is fatal. Then the ground opens. Explosions detonate from beneath staging areas, not at the perimeter but at the center of mass. Soil collapses inward, swallowing men, equipment, and vehicles. Fire erupts from fissures that didn't exist seconds earlier. What should be solid ground fractures into zones of movement and death. Orientation vanishes instantly. The psychological impact is immediate and overwhelming. Soldiers are trained to expect threats from ahead, behind, or above. Very few are conditioned to process danger coming from below their feet. When the ground fails, instinct has nowhere to go. There is no direction to return fire, no clear source to suppress. Shouts overlap. Commands collide. Someone reports enemy contact to the north. Another screams about fire from the south. A third insists the enemy is inside the hill itself. All three are right, and none of them can act fast enough to matter. Fire pours from concealed ports, cut low into the slope, angles designed to rake movement paths, not sight. Machine guns and small arms fire intersect across the hilltop, catching troops as they instinctively try to regroup. Smoke fills the air, but not from burning vehicles. This smoke comes from inside the hill, vented deliberately to obscure visibility and magnify confusion. At the same time, secondary detonations trigger beneath access routes and escape paths, not to kill, but to seal. Tunnels collapse behind defenders as they shift positions underground. Sections of the hill become inaccessible, isolating pockets of attackers who don't yet realize they are trapped. What makes this moment uniquely destructive is that it happens after the enemy has committed. There is no decision to abort, no time to redeploy. The force is already inside the geometry of the kill zone. Armor cannot maneuver. Infantry cannot withdraw information. Air support cannot identify targets quickly enough to intervene. And worse, nothing makes sense. Soldiers fire at shadows. Suppression hits dirt and stone with no effect. Every instinct screams to find cover, but cover no longer exists. The hill itself is the threat. Men dive behind rocks that conceal firing ports. Vehicles reversed into areas already compromised beneath the surface. Commanders try to reassert control, but the environment resists them. Maps are useless. The hill they studied no longer exists in the same form. Radio calls stack faster than orders can be issued. Even veteran leaders hesitate, trying to understand what they are facing before committing forces. Hesitation that costs lives. The enemy understands this phase intimately. They do not pursue. They do not rush forward. They let the chaos speak. The objective is not annihilation. It is paralysis. A force that cannot orient, cannot fight effectively, even if it still has numbers and weapons. Minutes stretch into something longer. Not measured time, but perceived time. Survivors later describe the same sensation. It felt endless, even when it wasn't. That distortion is deliberate. It is the final weapon of the Hilda collapse of the attacker's sense of control. Only after this moment does the true cost become visible. Casualties, equipment losses, broken units, and the realization, creeping and irreversible, that the hill was never empty at all. By the time an empty hill opens beneath an advancing force, the most important decisions were already made. What unfolds in minutes on the battlefield is the final act of a process defined by patience, discipline, and an almost obsessive commitment to remaining unseen. Subterranean warfare is not improvised under pressure. It is planned in silence. The first phase is selection. Not every hill is suitable. Engineers and commanders study soil composition, rock density, drainage patterns, and natural vegetation. A hill that erodes too easily collapses under its own weight. One that is too hard to carve exposes workers for too long. The ideal terrain allows excavation without obvious surface scars and can support internal voids without reinforcement that would betray human activity. Once selected, the work begins slowly, deliberately slow. Excavation is never continuous. Digging happens in short windows, often at night, often in poor weather, when noise blends into the environment. Tools are chosen not for speed, but for discretion. Hand tools over machinery. Controlled brakes instead of blasting. Every sound is a risk. The removed earth is treated like contraband. Spoil is never piled nearby. It is carried out in small quantities, mixed with animal waste, spread along riverbanks, dumped under existing construction, or dispersed beneath forest cover. Even the color of the soil matters. Anything that creates contrast draws attention. The hill must look unchanged to anyone passing by weeks later. Manpower is another constraint. Large work crews increase speed, but also risk. So the labor force is kept small, often rotated, sometimes unaware of the full scope of the system they are helping to build. Compartmentalization becomes security. Few people understand the entire layout. Fewer still know its intended purpose. Time becomes the greatest. Allege, because nothing appears urgent. Intelligence assets dismiss the area. Patrols move on. Surveillance focuses elsewhere. The hill's value grows precisely because it does nothing, while attention shifts to active fronts. The underground network expands quietly, one chamber at a time. Inside, the architecture reflects intent. Ammunition storage is separated from firing galleries. Medical spaces are isolated to reduce noise and light. Command cells are buried deeper, protected by multiple turns and elevation changes. Every design choice assumes the worst-case scenario: bombardment, partial collapse, prolonged isolation. This is not just construction. It is rehearsed behavior embedded into the terrain. Defenders train inside the hill long before combat. They learn routes by touch, not sight. They practice moving in darkness, counting steps, memorizing turns. They know where to wait, when to hold fire, and when to unleash it. Timing is everything. A premature engagement ruins the illusion. A delayed one wastes the advantage. The system also anticipates abandonment. Escape routes lead away from the hill, not back through it. Some tunnels are designed to be collapsed deliberately, once used, erasing evidence and denying the attacker any chance to exploit the structure. The hill is expendable. The effect is not. What often goes unrecognized is the psychological endurance required to build and maintain these positions, working underground for months, sometimes years, with no recognition, no visible progress, and no guarantee the system will ever be used demands belief. The builders must trust that patience will be rewarded, that restraint will matter more than confrontation. And this is where attacking forces misjudge their enemy most severely. They assume such preparation requires desperation, that only a cornered force would invest so much effort without immediate payoff. In reality, this kind of preparation signals confidence. It means the enemy expects the attacker to behave predictably. too advanced to occupy, to relax. By the time boots touch the hilltop, the labor is already finished. The trap is complete. All that remains is timing and the certainty that the attacker will do exactly what they have always done before. Failures like this are often blamed on bad intelligence, but that explanation is too simple. In reality, intelligence usually sees enough. The problem is not blindness, it is interpretation. Empty hills do not defeat intelligence. By hiding data, they defeat it by shaping expectations. Modern intelligence systems are designed to detect activity, not intent. Satellites look for movement. Drones watch for heat. Signals intelligence hunts for communication spikes. Human intelligence searches for chatter, rumors, patterns of preparation. Subterranean strategies exploit the gaps between these tools, operating below the thresholds that trigger concern. An empty hill generates no urgency. There are no convoys feeding it, no radio traffic coordinating defenses, no visible fortifications under construction. From an analytical standpoint, it is low-noise terrain. Analysts are trained to prioritize anomalies, not absences. When nothing happens, attention shifts elsewhere. This creates a structural bias. Intelligence organizations are flooded with data. Every hour brings more images, more intercepts, more reports than can be deeply analyzed. So filters are applied. Areas without observable change are downgraded. Hills that remain quiet week after week fall off the priority list. Silence becomes confirmation. Even when fragments of warning appear, they rarely align cleanly. A patrol reports strange soil compaction in one sector. An engineer notices unusual drainage behavior after rainfall. A local source mentions night activity but cannot specify location. Individually, these details are insignificant. They are logged, categorized, and buried beneath higher confidence threats. Intelligence systems reward clarity, not ambiguity, and subterranean preparation lives in ambiguity. Another critical failure point is doctrinal framing. Analysts unconsciously assess terrain based on how their own forces would use it. If a hill offers poor surface defense, it is categorized as tactically irrelevant. The possibility that it might be valuable precisely because it appears irrelevant is often dismissed as unlikely or inefficient. This is compounded by success elsewhere. When advances proceed smoothly, intelligence assessments are retroactively validated. The enemy is withdrawing. Resistance is collapsing. These narratives harden quickly. Information that contradicts them feels like noise. Analysts do not fabricate optimism, but they do filter pessimism more aggressively during momentum. Technology worsens this blind spot. In subtle ways, ground-penetrating radar, for example, is powerful but limited by soil type, depth, and resolution. Its absence of findings is often treated as definitive rather than conditional. Thermal sensors fail to detect systems designed to equalize temperature. Acoustic sensors mishandled tunnels that produce no consistent mechanical sound. Each tool has blind zones, but those blind zones rarely overlap in a way that forces reconsideration. And human intelligence has its own limits. Local populations may know something is wrong, but lack the vocabulary to describe it. They sense absence areas avoided, sounds that stop abruptly, paths that no one uses anymore. But intelligence reporting favors explicit information. There is a tunnel here carries weight. Something feels wrong about that hill does not. Perhaps the most dangerous failure is confidence in pattern recognition. Intelligence thrives on precedent. If a tactic has not been used in recent conflicts, it is ranked as low probability. Empty hills weaponized from below feel archaic to modern planners, associated with earlier wars or specific adversaries. That categorization creates complacency. But war does not evolve linearly. Old ideas resurface when conditions favor them. Subterranean tactics flourished when the attacker relies heavily on speed, sensors, and precision. They exploit the assumption that visibility equals control. Intelligence systems built to confirm dominance struggle to imagine threats that deliberately reject visibility. By the time intelligence revises its assessment, the hill has already served its purpose. The data was there, scattered and incomplete. The failure was not collection, it was synthesis. When the hill finally reveals itself, its physical footprint is almost irrelevant. What matters is the shockwave it sends through the operation. A single point of failure, activated at the right moment, can fracture an entire campaign far beyond the radius of the explosions or the range of the weapons involved. The first impact is temporal. Momentum dies instantly. An advanced plant in hours stretches into days. Timelines collapse under uncertainty. Commanders who expected to push forward are now forced to pause, reassess, and explain. Every subsequent movement becomes slower, heavier, burdened by doubt. Speed, one of the attacker's greatest advantages. The second impact is psychological. Units that were confident minutes earlier now distrust the terrain itself. Soldiers stop seeing hills as elevation and start seeing them as potential threats. Every rise, every slope, every patch of ground demands scrutiny. That vigilance is exhausting. It drains energy faster than combat. Fatigue sets in not from fighting, but from anticipation of fighting. This fear spreads unevenly and uncontrollably. Units that never set foot on the hill feel it just as strongly as those that did. Stories move faster than facts. Details blur. The hill becomes larger in memory than it ever was in reality. It opened beneath them turns into they were swallowed. Exaggeration fills the gaps left by incomplete information, and morale absorbs the cost. Operationally, the ripple effects multiply. Supply routes are rerouted to avoid similar terrain. Engineers are pulled from offensive tasks and reassigned to detection and clearance. Infantry advances shrink in scope, leapfrogging cautiously instead of flowing forward. Armor waits longer for confirmation. Air support is requested more frequently, but used less decisively because targets are harder to define. Command structures feel the strain next. Senior leaders begin questioning assumptions that once felt solid. Intelligent assessments are reopened. Reconnaissance is duplicated. Every plan gains additional layers of contingency. This caution is rational, but it is expensive. It consumes time, resources, and attention that were supposed to be focused elsewhere. Meanwhile, the defender gains something priceless: control over tempo without direct engagement. They don't need to hold the hill. They don't need to fight continuously. The knowledge that another hill might exist somewhere ahead is enough. The battlefield becomes psychologically mined. Even empty terrain regains value, because the attacker can no longer trust appearances. This is asymmetric leverage at its purest. A relatively small investment, time, labor, patience forces a much larger force to slow itself, dilute its advantages, and spread its attention thin. The hill becomes a reference point in every future decision. What if this one is like that? Becomes an unspoken question in every briefing, and this effect persists even after the immediate threat is neutralized. Once a force has experienced the ground turning hostile, it cannot unlearn that lesson. The memory shapes doctrine, behavior, and instinct. Every operation that follows carries the weight of that moment. Caution replaces confidence. Certainty gives way to suspicion. This is why such hills rarely need to succeed more than once. They don't win battles through destruction alone. They win by changing how the enemy thinks, by forcing them to fight not just the defender, but the landscape and their own assumptions. And long after the smoke clears, the hill remains exactly where it was, silent again, empty again, but no longer ignored. The cruel truth about these battles is that the lessons are never unclear, only late. Once the hill has done its damage, commanders suddenly see everything they missed with painful clarity. The signs feel obvious in hindsight. The silence, the lack of harassment, the strange absence of enemy movement where doctrine said there should be resistance. But by then, those realizations offer no tactical value. They become post. The first lesson is about assumptions and how quietly they harden into doctrine. Armies tell themselves they are adaptable, yet they rely heavily on expectation. When terrain behaves the way it always has, planning feels efficient. When it does not, the shock is not just physical, it is conceptual. Leaders realize too late that they treated the battlefield as a static object instead of a thinking adversary. The second lesson is about overconfidence and confirmation. Intelligence did not fail because it lacked data. It failed because it demanded certainty before doubt. Reports that didn't align cleanly with prevailing narratives were discounted, delayed, or buried. After the hill opens, those same fragments are suddenly re-examined and stitched together into a picture that now feels undeniable. The tragedy is not ignorance, it is timing. Another lesson emerges around speed. Rapid advances are celebrated, rewarded, and institutionalized. But speed compresses skepticism. It discourages friction. Unis learn that stopping to question terrain requires justification, while moving forward does not. After disaster, commanders recognize that unchecked momentum is not a strength. It is a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. Then comes the realization about the enemy. The defender was not weaker. They were disciplined. They did not retreat because they were collapsing. They withdrew because they were shaping the battlefield. Their silence was not confusion, it was intent. This recognition is often the hardest to accept because it overturns the narrative of superiority that sustained the operation in the first place. Survivors also learn something more personal. Training prepares soldiers for fire, noise, chaos, but not for betrayal by the ground itself. Many report the same sensation afterward. A loss of trust, not just in terrain, but in judgment, in leadership, in systems that promised awareness and control. That erosion of trust lingers long after the fighting ends. At the command level, doctrine begins to shift, but cautiously. Manuals are updated. New procedures are drafted. Terrain analysis becomes more rigorous, more skeptical. Yet even then these changes are often reactive, tied to the last disaster rather than anticipating the next adaptation. Armies prepare for the hill they just lost to, not the one they haven't encountered yet. Perhaps the most uncomfortable lesson is this: restraint can be more dangerous than aggression. When an enemy chooses not to contest ground, not to harass movement, not to reveal themselves, it may signal confidence rather than weakness. Learning to recognize that distinction requires humility and humility is rarely abundant in moments of advance. These lessons reshape careers. Some commanders are removed, others carry the weight silently, knowing they followed doctrine and still failed. The hill becomes a reference point whispered in briefings, an unspoken warning embedded in future plans. But even as these lessons are absorbed, one question remains unanswered because it looks forward, not backward. If these hills have changed how wars are fought before, what traces have they left in modern conflict? And how often are they still being underestimated today? What makes the legacy of these hills so unsettling is not that the tactic still exists, but that it has never truly disappeared. It has simply adapted, reshaped by new technology, new doctrine, and new assumptions about what modern war looks like. Contemporary militaries pride themselves on transparency of the battlefield. Satellites see everything. Sensors hear everything. Algorithms predict behavior. Yet this confidence has quietly resurrected the same vulnerability that doomed early forces, the belief that visibility equals control. The modern battlefield is crowded with data, but data does not guarantee understanding. In fact, it can create a false sense of complete. Today's empty hills are not always literal hills. They are urban blocks with sealed basements, industrial zones with underground transit tunnels, rural areas with abandoned infrastructure repurposed quietly over time. Even seemingly irrelevant terrain zones written off as economically or tactically unimportant can become decisive when prepared patiently and activated precisely. Modern defenders understand something attackers still struggled with. Complexity favors concealment. The more advanced the sensor suite, the more predictable its blind spots become. Subterranean spaces shielded by concrete, soil, and noise pollution remain among the hardest environments to fully map in real time. The hill survives not by resisting technology, but by outlasting its attention. Another legacy lies in doctrine. Armies now speak openly about multi-domain warfare, about fighting across land, air, sea, cyber, and space. Yet the vertical dimension beneath the surface is often treated as secondary, a technical challenge rather than a strategic one. This creates a gap between awareness and prioritization. The threat is acknowledged, but rarely weighted heavily enough to slow operations until it's too late. Psychologically, the impact remains unchanged. When modern troops encounter threats emerging from beneath terrain they believed secure, the effect mirrors historical accounts almost exactly. Confusion, disorientation, breakdown of tempo, the same human reactions repeat, regardless of uniforms, weapons, or century. Technology may evolve, but instinct does not. And just like before, the true power of the empty hill is not in casualties alone. It is in the aftershock. Once a force experiences this kind of betrayal by terrain, its behavior changes permanently. Advance is slow. Trust erodes. Every future movement carries invisible friction. The defender doesn't need to repeat the tactic. Often its memory does the work for them. Perhaps the most important legacy is conceptual. These hills remind us that war is not won solely by strength, speed, or superiority. It is shaped by perception, by expectation, by what one side assumes the other cannot or will not do. The empty hill works because it attacks certainty itself. It punishes the belief that absence means safety, and as long as armies continue to measure dominance by what they can see, hear, and track, There will always be ground that waits patiently to prove them wrong. The hill doesn't need to rise. It doesn't need to advance. It only needs to be underestimated. You've followed the story from the first deceptive slope to the hidden chambers beneath the hill, through the chaos, the shock, and the lessons learned. Now it's time to act, not just watch. If you made it to the end, comment below and type the word underground to show that you've seen how terrain itself can become a weapon. Share your thoughts. Which moment shocked you the most? The instant the ground opened, or the invisible preparation that made it possible? Your comments help others engage and spark conversation. Don't forget to hit the like button if you found this breakdown revealing. Every like tells the algorithm that detailed, strategic, and deeply researched military history deserves to be seen. And make sure you subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. We dive into stories like this every week, events that reveal the hidden layers of warfare, strategy, and human ingenuity. By subscribing, you ensure you never miss these insights. Finally, look to the video that's appearing on your screen now. It continues exploring battlefield tactics that shape wars in ways most people never see. Watch it next to uncover more secrets that lie just beneath the surface. Thank you for staying until the end. Your attention proves that understanding history is more than dates and maps. It's about uncovering the hidden forces that decide the fate of battles.